So tonight's presentation is about an excavation we ran in England about 10 years ago now. It's been a little while since this excavation took place, but we're going to break down tonight's presentation into 3 parts. Part 1, I'm going to just kind of give you the context, the background of the excavation, the background of the cave, and the background of the Iron Age. I know that not everybody is necessarily familiar with the Iron Age in Britain or in Europe in general. We're speaking to a North American audience, so I need to make sure I give some background on it. Part 2, we'll kind of cover Reed's Cavern, what happened there before we showed up, how we got involved in it. Part 3 will be our excavations that we ran in 2010. Part 4 will be our kind of conclusions of those excavations, what we kind of determined out of that. So to start off with, the Iron Age is one of the 3 time periods that make up the 3-age system that was developed in the early 19th century for dividing up prehistory in Europe. This was developed by a Danish scholar, C.J. Thompson, who worked at the National Museum there, and he was trying to organize all of the material into some coherent fashion. He came up with the idea that the Stone Age predated the Bronze Age, which predated the Iron Age, and that from kind of excavations and the materials that you could classify it and determine these ages. That's basically how prehistory has been divided up in Europe ever since. That as kind of colonial powers moving abroad, Europeans then tried to push that same idea onto other areas with varying degrees of success, mostly not so much, doesn't really apply to North American archaeology very well, doesn't really kind of capture what was going on. The reason why it is still in use for the most part in Europe today is because it does, for the most part, work. We've divided up all of these periods into a lot more kind of minute time divisions. So our Paleolithic, or our Stone Age is now the Paleolithic, the Mesolithic, and the Neolithic. The Bronze Age has its early, middle, late Bronze Age. Between the Neolithic and the Bronze Age, you sometimes have the Chalcolithic. Our Iron Age also has an early, middle, late Iron Age. But to kind of just give it, the Western European Iron Age is dominated by 2 main periods, and that's in our slide part of our picture down here. We have the Hallstatt, oh, I didn't mean to go back. The Hallstatt, which runs from about 800 to 450 BC, and kind of ends between 450 and 400. And the La Tene period, which runs from 400-ish into around the Roman period, depending on where you are in there. So 450 to 50 BC, thereabouts. As you can kind of see in the slide, you can see where the La Tene area was and where the Hallstatt area was. The La Tene expanded a little bit on what the Hallstatt had, but it's all the same kind of stuff. A lot of this came from France and Switzerland and Germany to some extent. These are Iron Age cultures. You can see some of the names of the groups that we have from historical documents up above, including some of the ones in Britain and kind of their areas of where they are. So in Britain, the Iron Age goes from about 800 BC to 43 AD when the Romans invaded. It does last longer in Scotland. It kind of goes up to the Viking period. And until Christianity appears in Ireland. So kind of outside where the Romans ended up, the Iron Age essentially is considered as continuing on, even though there is some differences if you want to get into nitpicky details in Scotland and Ireland after the Roman period anyways. The British Iron Age generally follows what was going on in mainland Europe. So, some of the earlier Iron Age follows the Hallstatt, later Iron Age stuff follows La Tene. You get some of these same periods seemingly similar happening in Britain. There's a lot of trade, there's a lot of exchange going on between the mainland Europe and Britain at this time. These are not isolated populations. There is a lot, they understand what's going on in the wider European world at that point in time. hill forts begin at the end of the Bronze Age and into the early bit of the Iron Age, which is kind of the Hallstatt period in Europe. This is a picture of Old Oswerty hill fort in southern England. It's just a good example of a big, massive hill fort with a bit of reconstruction of kind of the Iron Age village in there. Initially, the hill forts were more used for trade and seasonal gatherings, not a lot of settlement evidence from them. But after about 450 BC, so around the same time that the Hallstatt collapsed in Europe, and the Tene kind of took over, you see more evidence of people living in permanent populations in these hill forts where there's evidence of any sort of settlement in it. It seems to be a later bit of the Iron Age that happens. Most people, however, live in small settlements, kind of like this reconstruction here. That is a reconstruction of settlement near Silchester in England. Basically small villages, standard round houses that were built out of varying materials. In Scotland, you get brocks, and other places you kind of get this made out of stone, made out of wood, made out of thatch, made out of reeds. Kind of depends on what materials you have, but you get these small villages, sometimes isolated farmsteads, which were probably a family household, sometimes surrounded by smaller kind of outbuildings as well on these farmsteads. Allison.
Okay, so the Iron Age in the, this is Iron Age in Mendips. I think you went, yeah.
You went one too far.
One too far. That's the slide I need. Okay, so the Iron Age in southwest of England was represented by hill forts. Chris showed you a great example of a very large hill fort in the previous slide. You can see a example of one that's in the southwest of England, not too far from our site, here on this page. Hill forts were made up of bank and ditch outer boundaries of the hill forts, with usually two, I think in some rare circumstances, 3 entrances in and out of the forts, and then a settlement site within those bank and ditch. And then also made up of other settlement sites. There's some very interesting settlement sites, particularly Glastonbury and Mere Lake villages. Those were located in the Somerset levels. And they were actually villages that were created on a morass or a
Somerset levels are kind of in this area here on the map.
Thank you, Chris.
That's where they are.
They're created basically on a morass, so it's a man-made island that's made out of timber posts with straw and clay kind of packed in. And then a lot of the villages were, and the buildings within the village were connected together by raised walkways, basically, that were post and basically little sidewalks created out of wood within the peat bog. So the other type of site we get in the just outside what you would typically call the southwest of England is something called a black earth site, and these are going to come up again later on in the talk. And black earth sites characterized particularly by one in the Vale of Pewsey, and they were midden deposits, very, very substantial midden deposits, made up of really, really dark humic material, tended to be like 2 meters thick, and it would contain a large amount of artifacts, particularly pottery and animal bone. In some of these black earth sites, you would get pottery, like whole vessels that had basically been broken in situ within the black earth site. And then also kind of on the periphery, but worth mentioning, there were hoards containing metal artifacts and animal bones. So Iron Age, you get a bunch of different types of hoards, usually particularly associated with water. not so much in the southwest of England, but there were other hordes in areas associated with water, even if the horde itself wasn't within water.
Okay. So Iron Age, kind of in the Mendips, which are kind of a rise of hills just south in the kind of separating out the main bit of England and the southwest of England, that kind of peninsula sticking out. They kind of run across that area, which kind of creates this bit of a boundary there. In Reed's Cavern is right in the middle of all this. So Reed's Cavern, if I can find it in our map here, we're right over in here, in this kind of area over here by Burrington. So there's Robarrow. There's some other areas in here. This is Mendip area. There's a lot of sites kind of in this area. In general, we have several other cave sites, all in that area, including Robarrow Caverns, Wookey Hole, where there's Iron Age activity. The Mendips were also, during the Iron Age, is where mining first kind of took place on the Mendips. They're known for mining of lead and tin on the Mendips, but that really didn't probably get going in proper mining until the Roman period. And there are several hill forts throughout the area, because it's that barrier between kind of Cornwall, Devon, Somerset, and the rest of England in the southwest. There's not a lot of known settlement sites in the area. There's kind of and then in the immediate vicinity of Reed's Cavern, there's an Iron Age hill fort called Didbury, as well as a hill fort across Burrington Combe known as Burrington Camp. There's a significant number of supposed Bronze Age barrows in the area, which are, I don't know if I can, they're in this area. It says cumulus in here. There's a whole bunch of barrows right in here, as you can kind of see those barrows in the area. As well as a few linear kind of features that are in the landscape that are kind of unexcavated, and we don't know how old they are. Reed's Cavern is close to Reed's Cavern. There are a number of swallets, so basically sinkholes in the karst topography, which were used. One that's really close was used in the Bronze Age as a boiling pit. So we have just kind of a bunch of sites in the area in general. So it's not an unused landscape, but the use of the landscape does not seem to be generally habitation, and that's kind of the important part to remember here. Moving on to kind of Iron Age cave use in general. If you get the chance and have Amazon Prime, you can watch a Time Team episode about Allison Cave, which is kind of pictured here on the left, and that will give you kind of more in-depth on that kind of cave use and the kind of interpretation they came up with that cave. In particular, caves were used for everything during the Iron Age, or at least there seems to be some evidence for caves being used for just about everything. Alveston Cave, which is pictured there on the left, as well as Goss Cave and Cheddar, are areas where there has been purportedly evidence of Iron Age cannibalism. I'm not particularly convinced by any of the evidence for cannibalism. I think there's issues with trying to look for cannibalism archaeologically, both from a theoretical and kind of overall history of archaeology and why we use cannibalism and all these issues. I will not get into that at the moment. We can say that part of how we got funding for this was because some of our sponsors were interested in seeking out more evidence of Iron Age cannibalism. It was useful to get funding for this kind of rescue excavation later on. So caves, so remember Allison, the picture here. This is basically a good idea of something I'll come back to later on in the talk. This had restricted access. Basically, it was a straight down kind of sinkhole that was basically, as it's known in places of Swallet in southwest England, but it's a sinkhole there. And they think people were being thrown into them as part of a burial ritual in there, and so that they sunk down into this kind of hole in the ground. There was a natural hole in the ground. And then we'll see some of that in the next slide as well. I'll get into it. Domestic settlement activity is also cited in the literature as common Iron Age cave activity, even though not sure the evidence is great for that. Caves with easier access and larger spaces seem to have had a greater variety of activities taking place. Common evidence includes evidence of smelting. Iron smelting is some of the earliest evidence of iron smelting in Britain comes from nearby Robarrow Cavern and Chelm's Combe, which are both pretty close to Reed's Cavern. However, reading through kind of the excavation report for Robarrow Cavern, it also has a black charcoal-rich layer very similar to what we discussed as being an important part of Reed's Cavern. So, what exactly is a swallet? Geology is kind of important to understand here. Basically, the Mendips are a set of hills that came from an orogeny, basically an uplift that uplifted and tilted all the old geologic formations up. Important part is that we have from the top this old red sandstone, followed by limestone shales, followed by a harder, denser limestone, but that is still more solid than this limestone shales here. And basically what happens is water runs down along the top here, and it starts, and it hits this. It can't go through this, but it gets absorbed into this and creates pockets. Basically the rain, basically the water absorbs acid through the rain, all that. It ends up basically dissolving the limestone. We get our karst topography. You can kind of see there's a basic kind of geology for karst, limestone, cave kind of things. What's interesting is this is kind of at a zone between two types of geological interface. So essentially what happens here is the cave system is formed right along this margin between the two geologic formations. And in the case of Reed's Cavern, it becomes basically a boulder choke. Basically the roof of the cave collapses and fills. So it's basically a series of boulders about 50 meters from a more solid bedrock further down here that's more solid that it ends up stopping at, but it's just a series of boulders with cracks and crevices in between them falling down where basically chunks of the limestone have collapsed in on itself. So it's not a particularly stable cave system, and that's an important thing to kind of understand. The discovery of Reed's Cavern. So Reed's Cavern, we were not the first ones to come in there and find archaeology in there by any means. It's interesting to note is it was first kind of investigated by the University of Bristol's Speleological Society, which was founded in 1919. At the first meeting of the society, they suggested that where this kind of cliff face was, where there's kind of a bit of a swallet, a creek running towards it, kind of disappearing into the cliff face, that seemed like a good location for a cave. And so in September of that year, they removed 21 tons of material, searching for some entrance into a cave system there. Of that 21 tons, only 1 ton actually had blocked the area that was the eventual entrance where they entered into the cave. Some of that removal they did by dynamite. A man named Trapman was the first person into the cave itself. He entered the cave supported by Leo Palmer, who was, I think at the time, the president of the society, but he eventually became the primary excavator of it. And he got into this cave and he was blown away by, with his candle, by just the magnificence of the cave, the limestone formations, the stalactites, the stalagmites, most of which doesn't exist anymore. This is a great picture. This is actually inside the cave when they first were in there. This is, I believe, Trapman actually sitting on a boulder inside the cave itself. This is an early photograph of it. Have to understand that at this point in time, all of their exploration was done by candlelight, no flashlights, none of that stuff, just done by candlelight. We'll come back to that. Okay, so just to kind of make some notes on here. The cave was originally named Celtic Cavern, rather than Reed's Cavern. And it was initially mapped, and they collected surface finds only. They found a ton of archaeology in there, and they quickly realized that the cave had significant archaeological deposits because there was stuff literally on the surface. Over the next kind of 5 years, from 1919 to 1924, they did excavations. They did another season of excavation in 1929 to kind of look for a prehistoric entrance to it. So that's an important thing to note in there, that they were looking for a prehistoric entrance in 1929. There's a trench kind of noted on their map of the cave. This is their trench here. This is the only trench that is actually indicated in anything where they dug into anything in any sort of systematic way. They did grid out the entire cave and paint it all on the walls. So you can still see all these letters that were put on there on the walls in the cave, marking where those lines are. These are, of course, 5 foot by 5 foot squares, not a nice meter grid system. So, but this is the cave as they mapped it out in 1920 or so. This is where the water actually flowed into the cave at the time. It's the waterway in, and this is where they thought the original cave entrance was when they eventually got there. Principal stratigraphy that they had, that they called happening in there. So this is just basic stuff. They had, the very bottom of it was what they called a layer of cave earth. It's kind of a pinky clay, fine silty clay.
The stickiest clay you will ever work with. Yeah,
it's kind of a reddish clay that they have in there, reddish brown clay, covered by a black mud. We'll discuss that black mud. And in a lot of areas covered by anywhere from an 1/8 to an inch thick flow stone. All of their finds were either on the surface or within that black mud layer. And later on, Trapman, after they did their excavation near what they thought was a prehistoric entrance, suggested that the entrance may have been fitted with a door with a lock and key, and that steps may have been built to facilitate easier access. One of the keys to note here is that they thought that this was a domestic cave site. We'll get into why that's probably not the case later on, but that is kind of the important conclusions to understand from their side of things. They did find human remains, and I'll discuss that a bit more later on. Most of them were in this kind of area here on the surface, just in case you're having trouble reading what that screen says. Okay.
Okay, so what they actually found in the site, and they found a fair bit. They found a significant assemblage of pottery, fragments, but enough fragments to possibly represent more than 100 vessels. And they were actually able to reconstruct a small number of them. The pattern on the pottery that they did find was, it was distinctly Glastonbury ware. Glastonbury ware is named after Glastonbury Lake Village, which I mentioned earlier. And we're talking pottery that's dated pretty securely to the Middle Iron Age, so 300 to 100 BC. Not enough of, so though they did a relatively good job for the time period in terms of recording, you saw the map that they did, and we were actually able to relocate some of their excavation. They were not particularly good at recording the location of artifacts within their excavation. So we don't have a good idea of where the pottery scatter was for what they found. And then they also found a pretty significant collection of metalwork and stone as well. They found brooches. I believe their original excavation found 2 or 3 brooches. There were sickles. You can see those kind of on the, if Chris can poke at them with the little pink dot. Yeah. They found sickles. They found what they were calling nave hoops. It's possibility they could have actually been bands for a tankard as well, because they did also find tankard handles. They found a few late Celtic rings and half bronze bracelets, and then also something that they were calling shackles. Now, the shackles, you know, Chris mentioned cannibalism earlier in the talk, and these shackles have been used off and on to support that argument for people who are a little bit more imaginative. In all likelihood, they were actually horse hobbles. And then in addition to that, there were also a small number of stone artifacts. Particularly, there were spindle whorls for a drop spindle. You can see some of those on the side there. And then there were potentially a few other stone artifacts, but we don't have a lot of existing information about those stone artifacts that were found.
Okay, so I will talk about kind of the human remains here a little bit, and you can see that's one of them in situ here. That's how it was found in the cave. Total of 13 fragments of human bone were recovered. The analysis of it said that it came from about approximately 4 individuals, potentially 2 children. Most were found on the surface, like this one, or covered in a thin layer of talus, or at what was presumed to be the prehistoric entrance. So that area where the water flowed in, that they excavated later, that they thought was the prehistoric entrance. They thought the prehistoric entrance had collapsed on people in a tragedy, and that had killed them. So that was their interpretation of it, and so they found them in that entrance area. One fibula showed kind of cut marks, butcher marks, which made them, that's where that idea of cannibalism came from initially. And as I said, they had thought that some of the people had died in the collapse of the cave at the entrance.
Okay, so then in addition to the human bone that was found on the site, there was also a significant amount of faunal remains. Included both altered and unaltered bone, and a pretty even distribution of both domestic and wild animals. In terms of domesticates, there was pig, sheep, dog, goat, ox, and horse. There was also roe and red deer, fox, pigeon, a few other birds, rat, and wild boar. And in terms of the worked bone, they found particularly smooth pieces of wild boar tusk, and these were interpreted as being cheek pieces for a horse's bridle. So the conclusions from the original excavation, the interpretation in the 1920s was based off of the known types of existing sites for the Iron Age. So, you know, they thought that at the time the cave would have been well ventilated and well lit, like the quote that you see there. And they thought that it was a habitation, maybe a cemetery, somewhere that people retreated to in times of battle or war when they needed protection. So not a permanent habitation, but somewhere that somebody was going if home became somewhere that wasn't safe. And they based this based on the agricultural artifacts as well as the bones and the pottery at the site. And on a few outliers were the idea of the potential cannibalism. So they did all of this excavation, and all of the artifacts and all of the handwritten notes from the excavation were deposited in the Bristol Museum. And as I said before, they did actually take half-decent notes. They published reports in the Speleological Society publication, so we do have some information from the excavation, but Bristol was targeted during the Blitz, and the Bristol Museum was destroyed. So all of the, significant number, not all, but most of the artifacts were destroyed. All of the original notes from the excavation were destroyed. The archive was completely lost. And any artifacts that did survive the did survive the bombing were refired to such an extent they were completely useless for analysis.
Sorry. This is still you.
Oh, it is still me. So how did we get involved? It's a long, complicated story, as how you get involved in most archaeological excavations is. We were both students at the University of Bristol, and a fellow student of ours who was in the archaeological science program.
Yep.
Was also a member of the University of Bristol Speleological Society. So the curator of the Woodspring Museum and the had been caving with a group and noticed that some people were trying to open a new path within reeds. As we mentioned, it's an unstable cave, so there are constantly new areas opening up to explore. So some cavers were trying to open up a new area. The curator of the Woodspring Museum knew that reeds had archaeological deposits in it, because the Woodspring Museum actually had a few of the artifacts from the original excavation on loan to them. So he contacted the curator of the University of Bristol Speleological Society Museum, who then contacted our friend and said, "Hey, you're in the archaeology program, can you do an excavation?" And she said, "No, but I think I know somebody who might," which is where we come in. So basically what was happening is the cave was shifting and part of the floor was collapsing. And as part of that floor collapsing, that black charcoal rich layer that we mentioned previously was actually being exposed again. So they went and checked it out and said, okay, yeah, we really do need to get somebody in to excavate it. And we offered to run basically rescue excavation to make sure that none of any remaining archaeological material wasn't going to be disturbed. Feel me? Okay. Challenges of a cave excavation. As we mentioned, the cave was very unstable. So the first challenge of this was just making sure that we had the safety covered, which a big chunk of that was getting all of the appropriate caving gear. Because this was rescue excavation and had very limited funding, we needed to source a free hoard of caving gear. So the University of Bristol Speleological Society basically lent us all of their extra caving gear for a summer so that we could get this done. The other big challenge with this was light. So when you enter the cave, you enter in a relatively, not small in terms of you have to kind of belly crawl into it. You can kind of crawl into it, but you have to crawl in entrance that goes down pretty steeply. And once it goes down, you cannot see a thing. No natural light gets into this cave with the current modern entrance to it. So we had to get light and power, which meant getting a generator and fueling a generator and making sure that the generator had enough power to run lights for a day of excavation, which took a few bits of trial and error. I think we had 2 different versions, 2 different types of generator before we landed on a setup that worked and kept us lit all day. Funding was a challenge. We got a lot of funding through just people volunteering kit, as I mentioned. And then we actually worked out a deal with the University of Bristol to run the volunteer excavation as a overflow field school. They had too many undergraduate students for their field school that year, so we were the second option. Students could go to their usual field school excavation, or they could come out to read. And for doing that, they gave us a small amount of funding. So I think all told, we had about £1,000 in funding, which paid for our generator and our fuel and the lights and all of the artifact bags and just about everything you need for the excavation. We managed to fit into that $1,000, and then everything else. And the pump. There's a pump later on in this. The other challenge was the actual soil we were dealing with. First, we had to get British archaeologists to sieve. They don't screen. They don't screen in England when they excavate. But
or they didn't used to.
Well, while we were there, they did not. So because we were looking at areas in a lot of the sections where we were excavating, we were looking at areas that had already been previously excavated. We knew we were looking for artifacts that were going to be small, that were going to be things that the original excavators missed. So we wanted to have screening for that fact alone, but then we were also dealing with this very thick, very sticky, very, very tough to excavate soil that, I mean, it was all clay, but really, truly some of the stickiest clay I have ever encountered, and just about everyone on the crew, their hands were just sucked dry by this clay. Like it had enough limestone in it that it basically just decimated everyone's hands. And it was impossible to see artifacts in it. So we really did need the screening, but normal screening, it just clogged up your screen. You couldn't get this soil through a screen. So we actually had to set up a wet sieve system within the cave but we couldn't be introducing water from outside source into the cave because the cave is in a area of
sensitive
environmental area. I was trying to remember the British term, but it doesn't matter. So we actually set up a pump outside the cave that pumped water from the rivulet that ran into the cave, down the cave entrance to our screen, and then we're screening almost directly above where the water would naturally flow into the rest of the cave so that we weren't disturbing the water table at all in the cave. And then we also had to consider as well timing, which I don't think we have on this slide, but this cave is inhabited by bats as well that are protected. So we had to worry about our timing as well to make sure that we weren't running into any issues with the bats. And last but not least, we had to figure out how on earth to tie in any maps that we did of the inside of the cave. And we ended up doing a little breadcrumb datum system so that we could tie in our maps.
All right. Methods and mapping. So as Allison was talking about, we did wet sieve in there. But we had a few major goals when we set out to do this excavation. First was to see if there was still anything there. I mean, we had no idea what we might find. We didn't know what was going on with this exposed kind of dark earth thing. We didn't know what was going on. So it was just to see if there was anything still there. We really wanted to try and get the site mapped properly so it could be tied in properly, and so that we could actually really be able to see how it had changed, how the cave had shifted, that type of stuff. 10 years ago, 3D photogrammetry was not nearly as big as it is now. I really wish we could have done that, because it would have made some great stuff to actually have a 3D model of this cave and getting into it. Maybe someday we can go back and do that, because that'd be awesome. And we wanted to be able to see how it changed through time. All the finds were screened using a water pump in the stream, the hoses, in a screening area. That screening area was right over here. This is where we had our screen set up. Here is where water came in. This was the entrance we came in through. This is also probably the prehistoric entrance to the cave, but I actually think one of the things that comes out of this is, I think the excavations in 1929, where they dug out a whole bunch of stuff trying to find this prehistoric entrance, led to, in the 1970s, the stream kind of diverting itself down where they had loosened up all the soil and blowing through what was a blocked off entrance previously and depositing just a ton of talus until in this part of the cave. So this part of the cave we didn't even touch or think about touching, because it was just meters of talus covering it from where the stream had washed in material. Over there, we were able to relocate part of their trench and map it in with where our trench is. We had 3 trenches in there. We had this big trench here that was centered over where the cave was kind of cracking and where those cavers were trying to dig into it. Centered that over that. We had a little test trench over here near where the 1929 excavation was. The interesting bit about that is one of the professors at Bristol came out to visit our excavation, Alistair Pike. He came out, he decided, ooh, have you gotten any digging over here? I think there might be something over here, and put a little test bit in, and of course found some of the best material we had, best preserved material in this little tiny 25 by 50 centimeter little test thing to see what was underneath the talus from the 1929 entrance. We also put a little unit over here, trying to see if there was anything left over here. This is kind of in an area where they had talked about there being kind of smelting activity and stuff. We had a metal detectorist come in and help try and pinpoint stuff for metal detecting. He had found quite a few metal objects in this area when he'd been metal detecting it. So we targeted that as an area as well. We definitely had safety concerns. We tied up ropes. We put in all kinds of different things to try and make it stay safe. The wet sieving did get cold. The temperature inside the cave was, in Fahrenheit, it's like 67 or 63 degrees or something like that. Like, it's not cold. In Celsius, it's like 15, 16 degrees kind of average. So it's not warm, but it's not cold working down in there. 15, 16 degrees Celsius sounds about right. And so, yeah, we did it based on context rather than arbitrary stratigraphic layers. Basically the British method of excavating by context. Not all that different than excavating by lots, which is typical here in Canada. So, you know, all different ways of doing excavations depending on where you are. Stratigraphy in the dark sludge. Okay, so you can see our kind of stratigraphic drawing in here. Basically, we have our boulder choke. Directly above the boulders, we have a red-brown clay, which corresponds with the previous excavations descriptions of cave earth. There's small lenses of charcoal and faunal remains that we found within that cave earth that may represent earlier periods of use before the Iron Age, but we need to have that material dated. The only way to really know is to have that material dated, and we don't know. There are unsubstantiated reports of flints, which would be possibly Mesolithic or Neolithic, found during the 1920s excavations. We could not find any idea where they ended up. who had them, who did the analysis. We just found mention that they had been found and sent to somebody to do analysis, and not really anything to go with it. Above that cave earth deposit is a dark, what was called a dark sludge or black mud. It's the charcoal-rich Iron Age deposit in there. It was described in the previous excavations as well. Above that dark sludge was flowstone sealing the deposits. And then in some areas, we actually had flowstone on both sides of those deposits, basically bracketing the full deposit. So you could actually probably date the flowstone on both sides, get very accurate brackets for that Iron Age deposit because that flowstone came in at both times.
And we did actually preserve that in some places. We took out a sample of.
That's later on in our presentation. Yes, we did take out samples of that and preserve that in situ, so it could be actually dated later. Looking at the cave earth directly below that charcoal-rich deposit, there's no evidence of in situ burning. So none of that charcoal-rich material was burnt in the cave. There is no evidence at all of thermal alteration of that cave earth deposit. This was charcoal-rich material deposited directly on top of that cave earth. That's an important thing to understand. Within better preserved sections of the charcoal-rich deposit, where it was completely sealed by flowstones, we encountered complete carbonized branches, where you could even see the tree rings in the wood. Unfortunately, these carbonized bits of wood disintegrated with any contact. Importantly, this indicates that the charcoal-rich deposit was not washed into the cave. So this isn't something that washed in either. These are materials that were intentionally deposited into the cave. Above the flowstone was a light brown silty clay, similar to the cave earth deposit, and we think that has accumulated since 1919. Partially because it did bury some of the candles they used to excavate when they were doing it in 1919, which we recovered those candles. And that kind of deposit there tells us something about how that process worked in the cave, how that cave sequence happened, as we kind of understand more of how these deposits accumulated through time. And just as a note, at some point in there, there was a social event, basically, we believe a Boy Scout group came into the cave, lit a big bonfire inside the cave. That bonfire heated up the limestone above it. A chunk of that limestone collapsed and crashed down on their bonfire. We recovered a bunch of stuff in it, but we actually saw how that fire in the cave made the cave unstable and crushed a bunch of the fire pit there. I'm sure that was probably a pretty dramatic event to have happened to whoever happened in it. But we'll move on to what we found in the excavations.
So, what we found, evidence of the previous excavation and evidence of said Boy Scouts. You can see the little green army man there, right in the center of the screen. Bottle tops, the heel of a caver's boot, battery. A lot of this was uncovered from under that stone that Chris mentioned that fell. We also found bits of candle stubs from the original excavation. So we could actually...
Not pictured, unfortunately.
Not pictured, unfortunately. They did not picture it well. And they were very, very small. Like we're talking, maybe the size of an eraser. But very distinctly lumps of wax still with the wick in them, probably where they had been kind of set down on the ground while they were excavating. And then continue on. And then we found, considering that we were excavating somewhere where it had been previously excavated, a fair amount of pottery, same type of pottery that was found during the original excavation. 23 sherds is what we found. None of them were larger than 5 centimeters, but they were all that Glastonbury very distinct to the southwest of England during the Middle Iron Age. We also found a fair amount of faunal remains. We found both worked and unworked bone. You can see a piece of rib bone there in situ. There were actually 128 faunal bones or fragments of faunal bones. Rib bones and toe bones were the most common of what we found, and a significant number of the bones had evidence of butchery or some sort of cut mark on them. A few of the faunal remains gave some indication of some sort of pathology. So they had either broken or healed rib bones, and then there were another set of ribs that had clearly decreased bone density. So we actually had those tested to see if they contained TB, which they turned out not to. And then, so other than that TB test, there's been no analysis on the faunal remains as of yet. Rib bones were disproportionately represented, and I do wonder how much that has to do with their previous methods of excavation. About 3% of what we found had cut marks on it. And the big thing to remember with all of the faunal remains that we saw is there were two things that we would have thought would have been there that weren't. One is that there was no evidence of burning on them. So if this black charcoal rich layer that was in the cave had been in situ, had been her features, we would have had evidence of burning on the bones. There was none. The other thing we had no evidence of was the bones washing into the cave. There was none of the wear that we would have expected to see had these bones been washed into the cave. So the faunal remains supported what we were seeing, that this was something that was actually hand deposited into the cave and was not part of a natural process. And we also did find worked animal bone as well, and there's a great picture of one of the small toggles that we found within the cave. And then we also found one brooch during the excavation, extremely well preserved. The picture does not do this little teeny tiny brooch justice. It is in such good preservation that if any of us had been brave enough to risk it, you probably could have done up that pin. We did do a fair amount of research trying to pinpoint the style of this brooch, because when we started doing the initial research on it, we could not find any examples of this particular design of brooch within the southwest of England. And it actually turned out to be a La Tene II style brooch that was more commonly found on the continent and not found in southwest of England. So it's
or in England in general.
Or in England in general. So it was actually a unique design for the area, and then it's also unique given its size. You can see by the scale there, but it is actually extremely small. Like it kind of rests in the palm of your hand. It is a very, very tiny piece of metalwork.
Yeah, we got our identification after bringing this presentation to an Iron Age conference, and an Iron Age specialist from the continent was like, oh, that's a La Tene brooch. Yep. And was able to identify it when we had been searching, and none of the people we knew in Britain could help us identify this either. So it was something that happened from an Iron Age conference. Those conferences are useful. Okay. The human remains. We did find one bit of human remains. I had to go and get a license for the removal of human remains from the Ministry of Justice in England. That bit of human remains was a single tooth. We thought after finding that single tooth early on in the excavation that we'd probably find others, so I went and got this. I mean, they said if it was only one tooth, they probably didn't think they needed me to have this whole process from the Ministry of Justice. But we were hoping that we'd find more. We didn't. So we found that human tooth mixed in with some faunal remains within that black earth, that black kind of charcoal-rich layer. We got the permit. the permit really wasn't necessary. But we were able to get that tooth tested. We had a fellow PhD student, now doctor, has his PhD already, who was doing strontium analysis for part of his PhD, and he was happy to do a bit of a strontium analysis on it as part of just working on the technique and using it for part of his PhD. And he did the strontium analysis on it. It came back very decisive. Not that this image shows quite the detail of the isotopes for the Mendips itself. There's pretty unique strontium levels for just the Mendips. And it turns out that the person who had that tooth lived on the Mendips their entire lives, and was living on lived on the Mendips while that tooth was forming, and lived on the Mendips within the last year or two of their life. So there was no evidence that they had traveled anywhere outside the Mendips in their strontium analysis, which the person who was doing the strontium analysis thought that that was really boring and insignificant. We thought that that was fascinating because it meant the person didn't go anywhere. I mean, the Mendips are a very small area of southwest Britain. This is during a period where there was quite a bit of interaction between different groups. This is an area that was kind of a borderland between different groups. We would have expected, some time spent outside the Mendips. This person had not spent any time outside the Mendips. Interpreting those human remains, looking at all of the way the material came in, the important thing for us is to go back to that kind of stratigraphy and how those deposits formed. You'll remember we said that it seemed like the bones were situated near that prehistoric entrance, and on the surface were partially covered by flowstone just near the entrance, a little bit of talus, hardly even any flowstone covering it. To us, that seems like it's a later addition into the cave. So how we kind of suspect the sequences for the cave and how the human remains are part of that story is that during the Iron Age, the cave was open. It had a pretty wide open entrance like it does today, with a lot of kind of stuff getting in there, just general material getting in there, and the deposits of the dark earth material. At some point, that entrance collapsed, and it was collapsed, and it became more of a swallet, more of a sinkhole like Alveston Cave. And at that point, human remains were thrown into kind of this hole in the ground that used to be an entrance to this area where they put all this material, but was no longer there. So a late portion of the Iron Age. The latest find that was ever found in there was a very, very early Roman coin. So I think by that point, it probably sealed up completely and wasn't reopened again until the 1919. So I think we have something more like what was going on at Alveston, where they were throwing human remains into a pit, basically an entrance to an underworld, so to speak, however you want to look at it, with water flowing into it, and that washed those human remains into the cave in their kind of scattered nature that they found them. There may have been a lot more human remains there, but it doesn't look like the excavations in 1919 excavated it particularly well, and we don't know what else washed down into the cave further. And now that that entrance is reopened in the water during the spring kind of time when there's a lot of heavy rains and stuff, it really floods through there and washes through there. It is unlikely that we'll ever find anything there again. So that's kind of the important part to that. And now moving on to the charcoal-rich layer.
So we've mentioned a few times this black sludge, or this charcoal-rich layer that we found. So this charcoal-rich layer in the original excavation was interpreted as first, because they were interpreting this as a habitation site.
Or as smelting.
Or as smelting, but there was never, so I'll go into that anyway. The charcoal-rich layer, when we looked at it and had the benefit of going in with proper lighting versus candles, we were able to tell that this wasn't localized into hearth features at all. It was actually scattered throughout the entire cave floor in this kind of mottled scatter. There's no evidence within the cave of in situ burning anywhere on the cave floor. We know what that looks like from that modern fire, and we also know what that causes from that modern fire, which tells us two things. One, nobody had hearth features in here. Two, there was little to no opportunity to have some sort of industrial smelting process going on in this cave, because the cave structure just couldn't support that kind of heat. The ceiling would have come down on you. So what we were left with is we know we have this dark, rich charcoal deposit that, based on our finds within the excavation and the finds from the previous excavation, seems to be more characteristic of a midden or one of those black earth sites, but it's missing the extremely high artifact content that something like those black earth deposits had. So we needed to come up with some sort of other interpretation for this artifact, for this relatively artifact-rich charcoal deposit. In addition to that, we could pretty conclusively say that this wasn't material that was just being washed in as part of the natural process going on in the cave, because our artifacts weren't showing the wear that we would have expected, particularly that left-hand brooch would have been just absolutely decimated by the process of being washed into a cave like that. So the likelihood of this being washed in was slim to none. So at this point, we were kind of puzzled as to what was going on here until we started talking about what the interpretations were of the black earth deposit. They were interpreted in part as closing rituals for habitation. So we started to look at that, and then we started to think about some of the other hoard scenarios and votive offerings going on during the Iron Age, not within the Southwest, but on those boundaries that I mentioned, particularly associated with water. So in the end, what we started to kind of think with this site is what we've got is a somewhat of almost a variation on the votive offering, but rather than it being votive, we've got material either from a habitation site or from one of these, whether it was from an industrial site or where its origin is, obviously we don't know, that was in some way contaminated and needed to be contained. We started thinking about that charcoal-rich deposit and these faunal remains, these human remains, as somehow being contaminated and being sealed off in the cave. Looking at it as this was profane material that needed to be separated both from the sacred sites within the Iron Age and also from the mundane habitation sites. So we've got pictures here of landfills and storage of nuclear waste. These are other things that are buried underground, that are stored out of sight, out of the way, where they cannot contaminate daily life.
All right. So kind of getting back down, kind of ending our, how does Reed's fit into kind of the broader Iron Age side of stuff? Whether you kind of agree with our discussion of the sacred profane aspects in here, I really do think that the best way to understand this is that this was a place where out of mind, something that is toxic, something that is potentially dangerous, that challenge of thinking about it in a theoretical sense between how we envision sacred items versus profane items. Sacred items that are misused become profane. these are interconnected ideas and concepts within society. And best way to understand it is that this was a way to contain that potentially dangerous material. For some reason, whatever happened with it in its use, you know, whether the owner had died, if you're talking about some of the farming equipment, something like that, maybe that meant that the items were contaminated and dangerous and could no longer be used and needed to be cared for somewhere safe. These are all things that we can understand through kind of ethnography and cultural practices, how that can happen, how items can be just imbued with this fear that they are dangerous in some fashion because of their association with something else. As archaeologists, we are unlikely to be able to know exactly what happened in the world that made them potentially dangerous. What we recognize is how they were treated indicates that they were probably something dangerous. They were put in a sealed, and if you listen to Trapman's bit and believe that there really was a door on that cave with a lock and key, a locked and sealed deposit of items that was dumped in there, possibly with ideas of cleansing and protecting and all of that. That charcoal may have been part of the idea of cleansing these toxic items. So that's an important part of understanding it. The Iron Age more broadly saw the rise of more social stratification, which may have led to more social tensions and stresses. Sociologists have linked kind of social stresses with increased evidence of rituals, taboos, and an emphasis on cosmology when there's these kind of social stresses. So things like this pandemic that we're going through are a great example of when people start turning to religion, start turning to more kind of taboos and rituals and things in order to cope with those social stresses. So while that was happening, while there was more social stratification, while there was a bit of uncertainty in society, that's when we tend to see increases in these kind of rituals and taboos and kind of strictures that happen. And Reed's Cavern, with its kind of unique environmental setting, with its complete dark, underground, collapsing, burying itself nature, may have been a way to kind of negotiate and contain some of that negative stuff and help people deal with those stresses in it. You can kind of combine ideas of metal and fire and purification and water and cleansing within that cave. All these kind of ideas can be drawn out with kind of the elemental aspects of the cave site, with its water running through it, with its stone, with the kind of collapse, all of these things that were going on there with the mining in the area. There's a lot of things that kind of can be related into that. And finally, it's worth thinking about the site as out of sight, out of mind, but protected and safe. Objects were not just local objects, they also came from a long ways away. They were not just domestic, they were also agricultural. They were not just human remains, they were also all kinds of material remains and faunal remains. So it wasn't just something specific, it had a much more organized deposit to it. Where the project
stands. So where the project stands now. At the end of the project, all of the artifacts and all of the records for the excavation, so everything from our initial report to our scribbly mud-covered field notes, were archived with the University of Bristol Speleological Society Museum. There are quite a few avenues of research left. Originally, we were hoping that one of the volunteer excavators was going to take Reed's on as a PhD project. That did not, unfortunately, happen. But there's a fair amount of analysis that can be done on the faunal remains. There's micro excavation that can be done on some of the block samples we took. So Chris mentioned it briefly, that small little sample that Alistair Pike took, and also a few other samples where we've got that charcoal-rich deposit sandwiched in between two layers of flowstone. So there's dating that can be done on that. Plus, we know that there are actually artifacts sandwiched in between those two layers of flowstone. So there's micro excavation that can be done there as well. And those samples are stored at the Speleological Museum. And then there's also a fair bit of landscape study to be done in the area, kind of piecing together how all of this Iron Age cave use is fitting together with some of the barrows and some of the hill forts in the local vicinity. And then many thanks. We had it being a volunteer rescue excavation, we had a lot of help. The Wills family actually owns the land that Reed's Cavern is on and gave us permission for the excavation. Obviously, many thanks to the University of Bristol Speleological Society and to the University of Bristol Archaeology and Anthropology Society that also gave us a little bit of funding. Chris Richard, who was the curator of the Woodspring Museum, who originally brought the need for this excavation to our attention. Graham Mullen and Linda Wilson, who are on the University of Bristol Speleological Society board, and Linda is actually the curator for that museum. And then all of our volunteer excavators, the master's students at the time that decided to take on the role of our field supervisors, Dr. Alistair Pike, Professor Mark Horton, Dr. Andrew Chamberlain, Dr. Ann Tether, Liz Green, all came out, offered our opinions, did impromptu little excavations for us, helped us secure funding, took professional photos for us.
And we didn't thank Adam Stanford, who did a bunch of professional photos for us as well.
And all of our field crew and volunteer students. We had community volunteers as well who were part of the initial 2-week excavation before this was turned into a field school. So this was an excavation that definitely only would have happened with the many, many hands that we had helping.
So we will end there.